The new Supreme Leader of Iran has vanished. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of breathless claim that fills your feed every other Tuesday. But stay with me, because this isn't a rumor, it isn't speculation, and it isn't coming from a single anonymous source. Mojtaba Khamenei, the man who inherited the most powerful seat in the Islamic Republic just weeks ago, has not been seen in public for days. No statement, no appearance, no proof of life from a government that absolutely, desperately needs to project strength right now. And the silence is deafening. This is Iron Dispatch. I'm glad you're here, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what's unfolding in Iran over the next few weeks may be the most consequential political collapse in the Middle East since the fall of Saddam Hussein. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. This story isn't really about one man disappearing. It's about a system that was already fracturing, and then lost the one thing that was barely holding it together. Let's go back to February 28, 2026. That was the day Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron theological fist for over 3 decades, died in an airstrike. Not from illness, not from old age, from an airstrike. The Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic, the living embodiment of Velayat-e-Faqih, the principle of clerical rule that had defined Iran since 1979, was killed by a weapon traveling faster than the speed of sound. The symbolic weight of that alone is almost impossible to overstate. Khomeini built a system designed to be impervious to outside force, guided by divine legitimacy, insulated from human error. His successor spent 33 years reinforcing that image, and then, in a single moment, it was gone. The immediate crisis wasn't just military, it was existential. Who leads a theocracy when God's representative on earth has been killed by a missile? The answer the Islamic Republic reached for, quickly, without a proper succession process, without the kind of deliberative consensus that the system technically demands, was Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali's son. A cleric of modest scholarly standing, known far more for his role in the 2009 crackdown on Green Movement protesters than for any theological achievement that might justify supreme authority over 90 million people. And here is the contradiction at the heart of everything that follows. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was built on a specific idea. Khomeini's Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, was premised on the notion that legitimate leadership flows from religious knowledge, not blood. It was an explicit ideological rejection of dynastic rule. Khomeini didn't just dislike monarchies. He constructed an entire constitutional theology to make one impossible. The Islamic Republic was supposed to be the anti-dynasty. The system that proved God's governance required no king. Mojtaba Khamenei becoming supreme leader is, by the internal logic of that very revolution, illegitimate. That's not an opposition talking point. That's not Western propaganda. That is a theological argument that senior clerics inside Iran, in Qom, in Mashhad, in the seminaries that form the backbone of the clerical establishment, have been quietly making for years. The moment Mojtaba was elevated, the regime didn't just face a political crisis. It handed its critics inside the system the sharpest weapon they'd ever been given. Now add the economics. Oil is at $120 a barrel. That number sounds like a windfall for a petrostate, and in normal times it would be. But the reason oil is at $120 a barrel is that the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow channel of water. When that channel stops moving freely, the global market doesn't wait for diplomats to sort it out. It panics immediately. Analysts aren't being dramatic when they warn that prices could reach $200 a barrel if the closure holds. That's not a worst-case scenario. That's a straight-line extrapolation of supply shock arithmetic. Here's what makes this different from every previous Hormuz crisis. Iran doesn't control the narrative this time. In past standoffs, 2019, 2020, the various shadow wars of the early 2020s, Iran played the closure card from a position of relative internal stability. Khamenei was alive. The Revolutionary Guard was unified. The threat was calibrated. The message was coherent. Back off or we choke the world's oil supply. It was reckless, but it was strategic recklessness. Controlled escalation. What's happening now is something else entirely. The closure isn't a negotiating tactic. It's a symptom of a government that has lost its center of gravity and is running on institutional momentum rather than deliberate command. When a regime is operating by reflex rather than strategy, that's when miscalculations become catastrophic. That's when a naval standoff becomes a shooting war not because anyone decided it should, but because no one was actually in charge of deciding otherwise. And nobody is talking about this clearly enough. The coverage keeps framing this as Iran versus the United States, Iran versus the Gulf states, Iran versus the international oil market. But the most dangerous dynamic isn't external, it's internal. The Islamic Republic right now is a system fighting on four fronts simultaneously: a legitimacy crisis, an ideological contradiction, an economic pressure cooker, and a leadership vacuum. And the man who is theoretically responsible for managing all four of those crises hasn't been seen publicly in days. Where is Mojtaba Khamenei? Three scenarios are being discussed in intelligence circles, and none of them are good. The first is that he's in a secure location, bunker protocol, genuine security concerns, the kind of precautionary disappearance that governments do when they fear the leader is a target. This would make sense. His father was killed in an airstrike. The threat environment is real. But a bunker disappearance of this length with zero public communication, no video message, no state media appearance, that's not normal security protocol. That's a communications failure on top of a physical absence. And in a legitimacy crisis, communications failures are their own kind of catastrophe. The second scenario is that he's incapacitated, injured, ill, or in some condition that prevents him from performing his duties. This would explain the silence without requiring a conspiracy. It would also mean that the Islamic Republic is currently operating without any functioning supreme authority, guided entirely by the Revolutionary Guard and a fractured group of clerics with competing agendas and no clear mandate from the top. The third scenario is the one that no one inside the regime wants to say out loud, that Mojtaba has already made contact with the outside world, not officially, not diplomatically, but financially. Bloomberg reported that Mojtaba Khamenei holds an extensive real estate portfolio in London. London, one of the most expensive property markets on the planet, a city in a country that is technically part of the Western alliance that has been applying maximum economic pressure to Iran for decades. The man who now claims supreme divine authority over the Islamic Republic, the heir of a revolution that was explicitly, violently anti-Western, has been quietly parking wealth in the capital city of Iran's ideological adversary. Think about what that means. It doesn't just mean hypocrisy. Political hypocrisy is universal and boring. What it means is that Mojtaba Khamenei has a soft landing available to him. He has assets that exist outside the reach of whatever happens to the Islamic Republic. He has, in the coldest and most practical sense, an exit. And when the leader of a collapsing system has an exit, the collapse accelerates. Because the calculation that keeps authoritarian leaders in place, the understanding that their fate is tied to the fate of the system, that they sink or swim together, is broken. A man with a London property portfolio is not the same kind of hostage to the revolution's survival as a man with nowhere else to go. This changes the game. Step back even further and the scale of what's happening becomes clearer when you compare it to the only reference point that really fits, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. That conflict lasted 8 years. It killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. It devastated the Iranian economy, exhausted the population, and forced Khomeini himself to accept a ceasefire he described as drinking poison. It was, by any measure, the greatest test the Islamic Republic had faced since its founding. And it survived. Not comfortably, not cleanly, but it survived. The system held. The ideology held. The supreme leadership held. What Iran is facing right now, analysts who have spent careers studying the Islamic Republic are saying clearly, this is worse. Not in terms of body count, not yet, but in terms of systemic vulnerability. The 1980s war was a foreign threat that the regime could weaponize for domestic cohesion. An enemy at the gates is the oldest tool in the authoritarian playbook. It makes people rally. It makes dissent look like treason. What you cannot weaponize is the internal logic of your own ideological collapse. You cannot point at the enemy outside the walls when the argument destroying you is coming from inside the seminary. When calm clerics are questioning the succession on theological grounds, you can't call them agents of the CIA. When the Constitution your founder wrote is being used against you, you can't bomb it into submission. The Islamic Republic has survived external pressure for 47 years. What it has never faced is external pressure simultaneously compounding an internal theological fracture, while its supreme leader is missing and its ideological foundation is visibly crumbling in public. We are watching the opening chapters of something that doesn't have a clean historical precedent. And here's what matters for the next 30 days specifically. Oil markets don't wait for political science. Every day that Hormuz remains effectively closed, every day that oil holds above $120 and threatens $200, is a day that the global economy absorbs damage that will not simply reverse when the crisis ends. The pressure isn't just on Iran, it's on every government whose population pays fuel prices. The Gulf states, which have quietly been recalibrating their relationship with Iran for years, are watching this with a calculation that is entirely their own. American carrier groups in the region are not there for decoration. The question is not whether the pressure on the Islamic Republic will increase. It will. The question is whether there is anyone inside that system capable of making a strategic decision under that pressure, or whether what we're witnessing is a government that has passed the point where strategic decisions are still possible. Mojtaba Khamenei's absence doesn't answer that question, but it doesn't reassure anyone either. A revolution built on the premise that God's chosen jurist would guide the nation has now produced a hereditary succession that violates its own founding documents, elevated a man with offshore assets in a Western capital, lost its supreme leader to enemy fire, and watched oil prices detach from reality while the leadership structure goes dark. This is not a system that is struggling. This is a system that is discovering in real time whether it has enough remaining coherence to survive the test that history has placed in front of it. I don't have a clean conclusion for you. I won't pretend there is one. The story isn't finished. The variables are still moving. Mojtaba Khamenei may appear tomorrow with a statement that resets the narrative. The Strait of Hormuz may reopen under conditions we can't currently see. Or neither of those things may happen, and the next phase of this crisis will be something none of the current models are predicting. What I can tell you is this: the silence from Tehran right now is not just political, it's structural. And structural silences in systems under this much pressure don't usually end quietly. Stay close to this story, because whatever comes next, it will not be small.